All right, we're live. Thanks for joining us for another Mixed Mental Arts Chats. This week, we're going to discuss economics. And this week, we have. Oh, crap. Damn it. I screwed everything up.
You're doing so well, Dusty.
All right. I muted it. I'm very sorry. All right, so we got a trio here that's with me. We got Daryl, also known as D.
What's up?
Isaiah.
Hi.
And Reed, master of the voice. Nice wonder.
Hello, how's it going?
All right, so I'm just gonna put in my two anecdotes because I don't know jack shit about economics. So the only thing I've ever learned is I did have one class in economics in high school, and the only thing I could remember is supply and demand. And the other thing I remember is that our teacher told us that masturbation was the key to a healthy marriage.
That's accurate.
Good advice. Yeah, it's good advice.
As an unmarried, man, I'd say that's accurate.
Well,
I mean, if you restrict
just on
your
that note,
supply, the demand goes up.
Yeah. Well, it's just weird in high school, you know. First period is like the period where teachers rant about their personal lives. So my estimation is that that conversation came up because his wife shamed him by discovering him wanking off. That's what I'm guessing. He's just kind of justify it in front of the class.
Sounds possible.
Well, I think economically speaking, the reason why that's good advice is because when you're a young man, masturbation has both an unlimited supply and an unlimited demand.
Yeah, that's true. That's a pretty good view on it.
So,
unless you're a eunuch.
I want to start this one.
Well, you pick because I'm not an economic
wizard. Where do you want to start this one? So economics.
Probably. Here's how you start. I know.
Okay.
Just go ahead and explain what is economics.
What is economics? Economics to me, well, my understanding of economics is it's a system through which value is exchanged in a market, basically, and everything else are the details. So, like, then you get into questions like, what is value? How are things exchanged? What are the rules of exchange? What are the goals of a market? Does a market even have goals? Who are participants in the market? A whole bunch of things. And then, like, even before we had the term capitalism, there were markets, and even before there was civilization, there were markets. And, like, trading things that have value is a practice that humans have been doing since they were hunter-gatherers, and they still do in hunter-gatherer areas.
All right. So the notion that we are in a knowledge economy means that we are very much in demand of knowledge and it has high value.
Yep. And that dovetails into what I just said about what economics is and what is of value. So saying a knowledge economy, to me, that's kind of we've always been in a knowledge economy. Like, what creates the greatest amount of value for a society or the market writ large? Knowledge is always going to be the greatest power that you have in a market, because that allows you to understand how the market works and how to exploit it for your own benefit or for the benefit of those whom you want to benefit. And it may be that your benefit is exclusive towards you and your family, or towards you and your class or whatever, but it also may be that the benefit that you get from exploiting the market is that the market value as a whole goes up.
Mm.
So
So
if
would
you're
you
looking to
consider
have
the
value, like gross value in a market go, then yeah, you have to.
so would you consider the antebellum South to be like a labor economy? Like
Well, the antebellum South was more so a an agrarian economy. So they traded specific agrarian economies. In agrarian economies, the most important aspect is the land. So the land has the greatest value in an agrarian economy because the more land you have, the more you can produce. It's why, like, a lot of places in the West are more like in the South and West towards the Mississippi River into Arkansas and up into Kansas, Missouri, that area. Um, those are more sparsely populated than a lot of places in the rest of the country because of the agrarian tradition with that. And that has to do a lot with the political philosophy of Thomas Jefferson. But again, in an agrarian economy, land is of the greatest value. So when you have a lot of land, you're automatically going to have a lot of wealth, and wealth is something completely different than value itself. So we can define what wealth is. Within the economic sense, wealth is just the amount of assets and hard currency that you have that you can leverage on the positive side of your balance sheet. So
So basically the same as capital.
I would say yes and no, because wealth is a net value, right? So you have to look at wealth as you have to look at everything as a balance sheet when you're talking about economics, because there's no like there's no free lunch basically. So everything has an exchange.
So I like the idea of capital. Thomas Piketty, in his book, he obviously talks about capital
Which
a
book?
lot, and it's his Capital in the 21st Century.
Okay.
It's his book on income inequality. It's really popular, and it's probably the most in-depth look at income inequality and how taxation affects it. And he talks, and it's a really useful term, because what the book is essentially proposing is not that I actually agree with it, but it's a capital tax, and that means that you would get taxed on essentially what you're saying. Everything, like your wealth, meaning not your money that's sitting in bank accounts doing nothing, would get taxed.
Yeah.
Your stocks, everything would get taxed. So it's a useful term. Of course, the problem with that, which even he acknowledges, is that in this day and age, money laundering is just unstoppable. And so defining what people's assets really are is easier said than done.
That is true. It is difficult to define what people's assets are, what the rules are, and how we can enforce the law, basically. And Hunter Mott's just dropped into the room.
Oh, no.
Just like D.
And I brought.
Oh.
And you brought
lost your video.
Can't
Hunter.
see your camera.
Where are you, Hunter?
Hey, wait a minute. Say hi.
Hey guys, what's up?
Hello.
Who is that?
Who is that?
Who are you with?
This is Michael Brooks.
Oh, hi, Michael.
Ah.
How you guys doing?
We're good.
Look at that. Is that like a libertarian chuckle?
Not out of me.
Yeah.
Nice.
Hunter, your video's gone, by the way.
Yeah, it went because Michael hit low power mode because my phone is about to die. But the main thing is that I think Michael has some thoughts on economics he'd like to share with the group.
Well, hold on. Wait, Michael just jumped in on my talk about Thomas Piketty.
Oh, you're talking about Thomas Piketty?
Yes.
We're talking about capital, yeah.
Did you like it?
Yeah, I liked it. I mean, we were just talking about the
right.
the obvious problem of transparency and how money laundering is such an issue.
Yeah, I think Thomas Piketty's book is one of them. I think Piketty, Capital, Mark Blyth's book on austerity, and Kate Rayworth's are probably three of the most important books on economics that are out right now describing the current moment. And I think democracy is not just politics. It also has to be injected into the economy. And wealth and oligarchies need to be broken up in order for democracy to be an actual real thing. And we also need to figure out how to rebrand labor unions because they're actually your friends.
I have a question actually for you, if you don't mind. I've been watching a bunch of Blyth's videos, and like one thing he said that really blew my mind was that he really kind of seems not to care about debt, and he talks about it as if it's like, well, there's no inflation in sight, so like that doesn't so we could just blow up the deficit. But then you hear other people saying that like what makes more sense to me is that the debt is really it's future labor, right?
No, I mean debt, especially if you have control of your own currency, we're not in the euro as an example. So debt is not. First of all, debt can be written down. Debt can be forgiven. Debt can also, if the investment up front is right, can also, pay for itself potentially in the long run. Like it depends also what you're investing in on the upfront. You know what I mean? Like if you're investing in things that increase output and upgrade infrastructure and enhance skills, those are. But the more broad point, and I agree with him, I'm not at all worried about the deficit. The problem has been in our current problem has nothing to do with debt, right? It's about investment and distribution and growth, right? So worrying about deficit right now is like being like an obese person that's worried about overtraining. It's like not the problem we have at the moment at all. So I agree with Blyth. I mean, and I think, and most people who are deficit obsessed are people who it's not a clean concern. Like they just have a policy set that they want. They want to cut spending. They don't want to regulate markets anyways. And that's like a Trojan horse for austerity policies that they want, not a clean argument. But I'll
tell you one person who actually probably would agree with on most things, but I think doesn't agree with Blyth on that is what's her name? Mariana Mazzucato, I think her name is.
Mariana Mazzucato.
Yes. I think she's expressed that.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Said what?
No, I was gonna say she's expressed that view.
She's expressed which view?
She disagrees with Blyth on that. I think she expressed more of a view that when you pass a certain point of investment, that when you just start spending, like the recent tax cut, for example, that you really should be looking at what you're really doing because the future labor has to pay for that.
Well, I mean, and the future labor. I mean, but I don't think the tax cut primary problem is not because of what it's doing to the deficit. It's because of what it's going to do to people now, right? Like it's going to vastly increase inequality. Unless you're really wealthy, you're actually going to end up paying more taxes more likely than not. And it's also going to degrade a lot of other, things that we need to invest in. But that I haven't read her, so that's an interesting perspective. I'd be interested in hearing more about that. But especially if you're not, it's like we have control of our own currency. It's a very powerful currency and a lot of discretion about what we do with it.
Mm-hmm.
I love the idea of a global jubilee, sort of like global debt forgiveness across the board and resetting a lot of maps. There's no reason why we can't do it. I mean, I know a lot of bankers would be mad at you. Much. Well, I am not primarily concerned with bankers, guys.
Well, wait until see what Michael Brooks doesn't know is Michael Brooks is bragging about his 1,000 Patreons, and wait until he finds out that all 1,000 of them work at Goldman Sachs.
who work at Goldman Sachs, they secretly they're like it's like an S&M thing. So they pay for me to beat on them. They love that shit. Hey guys, I gotta run to go see my sister. I just did a bunch of stuff with Hunter that's gonna come out soon, and your community's awesome, and there's a bunch more from all three of us ahead on both shows. I hope you guys check out my show too, and I love what you guys are doing.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
All right.
Brother.
Thanks, Brooksy.
I will see you soon, man.
All right, talk to you soon.
Thanks,
we just
man.
did a really awkward car hug thing that kind of almost turned into a kiss.
Yeah.
The turning heads where your lips get really close.
Video or it didn't happen.
Yeah.
It should have been on video.
Yeah. Well, anyway, guys, sorry. I thought that would be like a fun thing for you guys to get to talk to Brooksy, but hope it was.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
I miss
Namaste.
the thing about debt, because talking about debt makes me want to drink. So I went and got some whiskey.
I completely missed it all. My internet just crapped out. But now
So recap on the debt issue, because you were talking about that before Brooksy got on about how Piketty says that debt essentially doesn't matter, right?
No, it wasn't Piketty. It was Blythe.
Oh, Blythe says that debt doesn't matter. So
Yeah.
so what is his thesis, and how does he back that up?
Well, he's saying exactly the same thing as Michael just said, that what it really comes down to is because of our odd dominance over currency, we can get away with it essentially.
So he's talking specifically about U.S. sovereign debt.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, U.S. public debt essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, it's called the U.S. national debt or U.S. sovereign debt.
Yeah.
Publicly sold debt.
Yep.
Yeah. I would say that there's a lot of variability in that, and the question is, how do we have enough money to service the debt? So it's about ratios there.
You know, I have a different take on it. I actually think it's all well and good until you don't control the money supply anymore, and like how long is that hegemony gonna last?
As long as oil lasts.
Well, that's fleeting.
Well, that's
It also depends on the possibility that if people, for example, I know Diane is a big fan of a lot of the cryptocurrencies, but if people decide that some cryptocurrency is a much more trustworthy medium of exchange, then essentially the seniorage effects that the U.S. gets out of the dollar being the world's reserve currency get lost. And that is entirely possible. It could be a cryptocurrency. Some people talk about the yuan. Jim Rickards talked on the show about the idea of a gold-backed ruble or something like that. So ultimately, this all relies on trust. And, essentially what the U.S. is doing is betting on that trust, using up that trust. And at a certain point, that trust can run out. And, you might see movement to some other sort of currency.
I think that's exactly the issue. It's not so much about us hitting some sort of limit on how much debt we have and it all blowing up. I think the trust is going to decay and something else is going to take its place. Like, I don't know, like some sort of cryptocurrency that's currently being backed by like international banks called Ripple. I mean, maybe not that, but it's even something like that. I mean, do people have to abide by the same standards and laws when they trade Ripple as when they trade U.S. dollars? I really don't know, but it's definitely a question for the future.
Yeah, that dovetails into how the internet has affected economics writ large, in so much as basically groups of people or corporations or whomever like it's indistinct at this point who owns what or who has the power on the internet, but it's taking power, at least some of the power as far as currency or regulation or communications, away from nation states and into other hands.
Yeah, or into the hands of less powerful nation states.
Or into the hands of less powerful nation states. I feel like the internet in that respect is a lot like firearms. Like the advent of firearms changed the balance of power, because before firearms, the nation with the greatest amount of people would win the battles typically, because
Cavalry,
well, yeah, well,
right?
it's dependent on terrain too, but
Yeah.
like if you have the population to take a punch, then you can fight for longer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Did I kill that conversation by talking about war?
No, but you definitely dragged my head into down some rabbit hole.
Yeah, this should be called the rabbit hole chats.
Well, that's also, I mean, Jim Rickard's point in currency wars is that this will be a form of war. I mean, there's nothing would be more effective in fucking up the U.S. than destroying its position as the world reserve currency.
Or the Eurozone, for that matter.
It's same thing.
Yep.
So, I mean, you know, war will probably move, you know, it's already moved into the information space. You know, to some extent, it's moved into the currency space. So I think that the war metaphors are going to be very interesting because, you know, it's conflict will happen on different playing fields.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's gonna move off the playing fields that it used to be on, because you know, even if where this is a chat about economics, you look at the world right now as far as the powers, the major powers, and economically, Europe as a whole is big. I mean, if there is a united Europe of sorts in the future, a real united Europe, it'll be a powerhouse. But right now, it's China and the United States, and like these are two countries who feed off each other economically, and so like neither of the biggest powers can afford to have the other power go down. So the idea that there'd be some actual war between the two is ludicrous. It's going to be these currency wars, hacking, you know, all these little subversive things that you can easily cover up or deny.
Well, Daryl, as the resident expert on China and potential military conflict between China and the United States, I would say that regardless of how remote the possibility is, the possibility is still there. Like, so economics goes into global geopolitics and foreign relations so deeply that any misstep can basically cause a war. So right now, just in the China America realm, there are two island chains that are literally being contested by Chinese warships facing off against Japanese and American warships in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, and the Philippines are involved as well. So any misstep there could potentially lead to large scale conflict. Now, the last misstep that led to somebody dying was in 2001, March of 2001, when a Chinese fighter jet crashed into a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft, and the Chinese pilot ended up dying. So, I mean, we were able to get through that.
Yeah, I mean, listen, militarily there's a lot of conflict, but I think what you're going to end up seeing is more like a situation like you see between like maybe even not Israel Palestine, but maybe Israel and Iran. You know, where you're dug in and it's trench warfare and you're not really aggressing because you can't look like the aggressor, and you know it's going to be like more like that. I mean, there's not going to be this. And when I say economically, I mean if you look at not just to the extent I don't just mean that we feed off each other because they make our goods, and then we obviously buy the goods, and then we take the money that they spend for the goods, then we put it into put it into Wall Street, and we spin it in magically and make more money. But also the sheer investment in our economy after the 2008 crash. I mean, China saved the United States. It's that simple. I don't think that's arguable.
I think that is arguable. I
Economically,
I think it's arguable, and there are several factors in that. What are you basing your argument on?
they more than doubled their debt to stabilize the economy of the United States.
Stabilize the economy how? Stabilize the housing market, or stabilize the dollar?
By pumping massive money into the United States by buying bonds.
By buying a ton of U.S. bonds. Okay, that makes sense. I would say they are not exclusive in saving the U.S. economy. It's a part, and there's trade-offs.
I'll tell you what. Europe wasn't saving it, so.
Well, that's true, and I'm not saying this, that, or the other saved it. What I am saying is that China owns less than 10% of U.S. foreign-held sovereign debt. Less than 10% of foreign-owned debt. Most of the sovereign debt is owned by Americans, some 80% of it. So
what was that number? What was that number directly after the 2008 crash?
I think it increased some, like, either by 2% or by 5%.
Yeah, but I mean, it's obviously you can't. Nothing's cut and dry. But my point is that they're heavily invested in the United States.
Of course.
In both how our countries operate and in sheer money. So
of course,
that was the point.
And the United States is heavily invested in China as well. Like Boeing, General Motors, and like Lockheed Martin all have built tooling factories in conjunction with Avic in their big aerospace centers, basically. And it's funny because the state-owned aerospace company produces all the airplanes and produces also all the cars in China. So, like, they're the premier engineering arm in China. So
China, oh man, like, are we gonna go down the Chinese economic rabbit hole? Because I mean, that just blows everybody's models out of the water. It's so convoluted.
Well, no, it doesn't really blow historical models out of the water, because prior to the Opium Wars, they were the biggest economy in the world by an order of magnitude. And then they had 100 years of war, and that will
as far as modern economies, I'm saying
you can't look at things in terms of quote unquote modern economies, because there's no hard and fast start-stop point, man. Like,
well, there's a point after, like, the Industrial Revolution where you had more of what you could call.
So all right. Yeah. So when did the Industrial Revolution start then?
Well, I mean, you don't have to set it a point to know that there are economies currently, right? So
there are economies currently, but the balance sheet goes back to several hundreds of years. Like, the only reason why the United States is the premier economy in the world right now is because of after World War I, all the capital fled from Great Britain, which was the banking capital, to the United States. So, like, you can't look at modern economics without looking at
history. World War II, the same thing happened.
To an extent, but it was less of a paradigm shift.
The United States owns 50% of the world's wealth after World War II.
And then we have to get into the discussion of what is wealth. But
and also, basically, where does wealth come from?
Yeah. And then you get into the theory of value.
It comes from your parents, Hunter.
Oh, that's right. I want a pony.
Do you think sometimes value is misguided? Like for me, you see, like, I'm not trying to, like, start a gender war here, But me personally, I'd never want to become like a CEO of a company just because of the demands of that position just seem insane. But as far as like personal value can be variable. Like someone may really want to value that position and someone can care less, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, sorry. Go ahead, Isaiah.
I was going to say that the two main theories of value that are used in academia are the labor theory of value and the subjective theory of value. So basically, labor is what adds value to anything, be it food, be it a automobile, or be it this bourbon that I'm drinking. So within that, you have to look at everything along the chain that led to this bourbon in my glass right now and this tobacco that I'm about to put in my pipe. And
But fundamentally, wouldn't value just be time?
that's what my inkling, my opinion is that the best fiat to understand value is time.
Yeah, and what you choose is valuable, like using that time. Like I said, for me, I wouldn't find the pursuit of being a CEO valuable for me personally.
Yeah. And like I gave up
Doesn't it?
like legitimate jobs to pursue something that gave me more value than the money was.
But doesn't also, and I mean, you know, I know that this is always where my brain goes. What about emotion? Because, you know, I mean, right, like you value the experience, the time with people that you care about, and then time spent with people that you care about less is less satisfying. Or, you know,
Therefore, it has
might
less
be,
value.
yeah, so I mean, part of it is that emotion, like for example, right, we take 2 glasses of bourbon that are the exact same glass of bourbon, right? But for Isaiah, it has a particular set of memories from some experience that he had, you know, 20 years ago that are potentially positive. And, you know, though, say, Di doesn't have those, or D does not have those same emotional experiences, so they don't value it evenly, even though the, you know, glass of bourbon is the same materially.
Yes. So that lends to the subjective theory of value, right? So each of these commodities that we have, each of these things that we use has a different subjective value. Like for me, I want to eat food that tastes good and is nutritious. Some people just want to eat food that is nutritious, and some people just want to eat food that tastes good. And then you have the amount that they eat as well. So even something as basic as food has different value to different people based on different criteria.
Or, you know, something like the rhino horn, which to us doesn't have the value that it does in Eastern countries.
That's an oligarchical thing. It's a status thing more so than anything else.
But I thought they also tried to use it to like treat, you know, cancers, and you know, it's part of Asian medicine,
There's
and
not
that
a
it's
lot
kind
of
of like
there's not a lot of variable information that you would get about the Chinese economy or science community in American media.
yeah. Well, this is
Basically, I'm saying
outside of
that the
China. This could be like in Vietnam or you know many of the other Asian countries.
yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, where I found out about it was like a Vietnamese man had sent like it was a documentary, but a Vietnamese, I think he was like a professional, like maybe a doctor or lawyer, had paid some money, not directly, but the money ended up in the hands of poachers, which you know killed the rhino over its horn.
Yeah, uh, shit happens, and that's not to be calloused or stupid about it, but
No, I know what you mean, but you know, there's just like some really good ways to fix that problem. Like I know there was this one British zoologist who also runs a rhino sanctuary, and he's like, you know what? Let's just grow these and chop them off, but leave the rhinos alone. I'm more than happy to give these rhino horns to you if it's going to help with conservation.
That's interesting.
Well, then there's that whole wrench in that equation is that rhinos have value for preservation, and also if they sell tags to hunters, then it increases the amount of rhinos that they can save. There was that episode of Radiolab called The Rhino Hunter on that topic.
Yeah. That was a good episode.
That whole thing is really enlightening, to people who are. I mean, like, for a long time, I was like very emotional about that whole thing, and like, you shouldn't kill them because you just shouldn't kill them, and you're like, but that's not the whole story. And when it really comes down to it, it's a matter of how many rhinos are you saving, and that's really it, right? It's not about how squeamish you are about having to give a tag to kill one rhino. If you're saving 20 and killing one, you have to do that.
Yeah, it's all about the net positive effect.
Yep.
Yeah, there are also weird local effects. I mean, for example, in South Africa, they have this big problem with elephants because they're so good at conserving elephants, but then the elephants can't move across the border. So they have overpopulation of elephants, and it's like anything, you start to have too many elephants. Well, elephants churn up the landscape, and that churning up of the landscape that is healthy when they're at a sort of normal level or a healthy level becomes massively destructive when you start to have too many of them. So, again, like we can have whatever theories or high-minded principles about rhinos or elephants or economics more generally, but at a certain point, rubber meets the road, and we have to look at, okay, what is the practical effect of this policy? How is it paying out? And is it really paying off into some result that we would actually want?
Yeah, that's a lot of things that people don't look at when they talk about what policies should or should not be enacted. Like, what are the negative externalities of having a ban on hunting elephants in South Africa? You get a lot of problems therein, like you just described. And Michael Woutenberg just joined the Google chat. Hi, Michael. Can you hear me? I don't think he can hear me. Anyway, let's talk more about economics. Is anybody?
Yeah, that it's worth talking about as well from Mark Fly's austerity book, which is something that I'd really been exposed to, is that you take this narrative around austerity that we should balance the budget and we should engage in fiscal responsibility, which is a great narrative and a great idea. But in practice, the way that it's often being used is that it's being used as a justification for defunding programs. And that what you have is that you have, massive fiscal irresponsibility. And then when the banks blow up or you have some sort of systemic problem, that now, we got to tighten the belt, and that rather than the banks blaming themselves and failing, they blame the state instead.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely an aspect, but like everything else, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because there were failings on the part of the government as well that led to the problems that we ran into in 2008 with the bank crisis, like the regulations that allowed investment banks to mix with personal banks. That was one of them. The regulation rollback that based or the regulatory failure that allowed derivatives to be traded in the way that they were at the time. And I can't remember.
Was it because of the merger of the personal to the business that the business banks had the luxury of social welfare for their failings, like because they could essentially tap into the government's ability to back our money if something goes wrong?
Yeah, Um,
Yeah. Well,
that's
that
a
money,
complex
that money.
issue.
I was gonna say that money's backed anyway, and that's one of the problems.
I mean,
Well, the problem is since the investment banks merge with the personal and private banks, that the private banks don't have the insurance backing from the government, or shouldn't, if they're making those risky hedge fund type investments. But when they get tied into our normal personal banks that we use on local levels, all of those are federally insured. So, if the investment banks fuck up, then they're gone. But if our banks
Yeah.
fuck up, our personal level banks where we store our money fuck up, and that just totally screws everybody.
yeah.
Yeah.
That-
But when we're talking about something like this, like we all know there was issues in the past, but really the question is what are we doing moving forward? And you look at the environment right now, and I love that one thing that everyone agrees with across the board. Um, whether you're a libertarian or whether you're a socialist, the thing that economists right now agree with is that shit is about to hit the fan. And like, we haven't put in place any more regulation or systems that are going to help to stabilize things or
But D, the
you know,
shit's always about to hit the fan.
no. The exact same thing is going on that happened before the 2008 crisis.
Well, yeah, there's about to be a student debt crisis instead of a housing debt crisis.
No, there is also a housing debt crisis.
Yeah.
That's the problem, and we're not. And the problem is regulation, and I mean, it's not. The Democrats are slightly better than the Republicans, and you can look at Clinton's record to show that. I mean, their addiction for Wall Street is just that's what it is. It's an addiction to Wall Street.
That's an issue. That's an issue of campaign finance and special interests more so than it is a question of a political ideology. And that's because
Yes.
the market. That's because the political market is a market, and it's not political service.
Right.
That's
the biggest problem in our
and
country.
it has
I agree
nothing to
there.
do with Republican or Democrat.
That's wrong.
Public laws.
I would say that the Republicans are just better at playing the market than the Democrats are. The Democrats just suck doing market related stuff, so they're worse at raising money from Wall Street people.
Yes, but also John Roberts is the king of campaign finance, and that's his goal as a Supreme Court justice, and he was put there by George Bush. So I mean, one is a little worse than the other.
But that the campaign finance issue started back in the 1970s. You can't look at the last 15 years and say that all the problems that we have started by a Republican in Congress, because during the Nixon administration, it was a Democratic Congress.
100% of the people in the politics today, in the Senate or anywhere, they're 100% of the people who are saying anything about this campaign finance issue and that Paul Ryan got $500,000 for pushing the tax cut. They're all on the left. There's not a single person in the Republican Party standing up and saying, "Oh, all these bribes I'm getting from the massive corporations, they really suck." No, of course not. They're the ones benefiting from it. Who's paying the people on the left? The unions? I mean, they've been decimated.
I mean, we could pull up a balance sheet and look, and there's also a reason why the Republicans control everything. So
Donald Trump did say we should drain the swamp.
I think he lost the drain plug.
Yeah, and then he brought Wall Street in to run the country.
But I mean, what I think that what I really appreciated was what Dustin said in a very subliminal messaging type way. What did you say there, Dustin?
Republic lost.
Larry Lessig is going to be on the podcast soon.
And not only that, Larry Lessig, Brian Callen, and I are starting a Google Doc to figure out all the meaty nuggets that Bryan Callen can then go out and share with people. So we're going to be figuring out how to, because I think that's the big thing, is that ultimately, like, you know, I'm sure that literally 300 million people are watching this MMA chat. You know, before this MMA chat, the big problem was just fucking indifference and a lack of knowledge of what was really going on or what could even be done about it, or that this is even a conversation that we should be having.
See, I don't know that it was indifference in that sense, because, so I shared a link if anyone's paying attention to the group chat. So this was something that I came across a few years ago, and it kind of goes step by step into the 2008 crisis and then where the roots came from, because it's really too easy to say, well, it was a lack of regulation, because in the end, it was actually an excessive amount of regulation, but regulation that pushed the banks to go take actions they wouldn't otherwise on their own. And then when we say it's a lack of inattention, the issue is people were benefiting from it. Stockholders were benefiting. The lower class was benefiting with the lower class is benefiting with, you know, reduced interest rates on their loans and all this other stuff. And politicians were benefiting by reactions to votes.
Yeah, there was a lot of issues with the subprime lending, and that was like there were a lot of people who bought houses who couldn't afford houses.
Right, and that was very evident in Arizona. So I mean, that's like one of the key areas for the crash was in Phoenix and Tucson. And there were people. I mean, there's a rule that banks used to follow. It was pretty well known for decades. It was it's like the 28-32 rule, where no more than like 28% of your net income, or I'm sorry, 28% of your gross income towards a house, and no more than 32% total gross income in debt and total debt load. And the issue was they were reducing, or they were being forced to meet these regulations to reduce that quota. So there were people who were at more than 50% of gross income. When the economy tanked and one of them lost their job, then they were over 100% of gross income plus additional debt load, and that caused the massive amounts of foreclosure, specifically in Arizona.
Do you think, Michael, that the people who were buying these subprime mortgages were really aware of what was going on with campaign finance?
No.
Well, I'm not going back necessarily to campaign finance right now. I don't even think it really has as much to do with that sense. I think campaign finance is the way that the banks try to protect themselves, because you look at it, what banks actually suffered during the crisis? None, because every single one of those banks were bailed out by the taxpayers.
Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers.
So actually, here's an interesting aside on that. So the banks took out or gave out subprime loans, put themselves at risk, divvied the things up to try to reduce the risk, put them into the mortgage-backed securities and different other funding schemes, tried to get investors to buy into those. When everything hiccuped, all of that crashed down. These banks were then compensated for those losses. And there was actually somebody did the numbers, and they're like, wait a second. So I bought a loan from, let's just say, what was the big one? Countrywide. And I bought the loan from Countrywide, and Countrywide took that loan and split it up and literally lost it. And then the taxpayers came back and gave back the money to the bank. So the bank is actually back at parity, but where's the asset? I own the asset. That's actually the physical house. So they were able, there's a lot of different homeowners who were able to go back, who kept their home, who were able to go back and say, no, the bank actually had the loan already completely and utterly paid for. Therefore, the mortgage no longer stands. So the banks at a certain point in time were actually double dipping. They were still charging the homeowner for their loan, even though they were completely compensated for that loan by the taxpayers.
Huh.
It was really kind of interesting. And several thousand homeowners were able to get their mortgages completely wiped off because that's illegal double dipping.
You know, the one side that I always like to note, because it always, you know, it goes against my usually leftist economic views, is the things like financial insurance, you have to admit that when you say that something's back no matter what, there are unintended consequences. It's like bombing a country, and you think things are going to be straightforward. You don't know what's going to happen. So I mean, that's certainly true, and I think it had a lot to do with the crash of 2008. But that's the same thing you're seeing in Europe. That's called moving debt from bankers onto the public, and it's exactly the same thing that happened over there, and it's because when all those banks were about to go down, the question should have been, well, who really is going to get hurt here? Like you said, our asset is the home. The bank's asset is the loan, not the home. The bank's liability is the home. So if all the banks, let's say, went under, that just means that nobody has to pay for their house. The whole washing machine, stops. The whole wheel stops. Yes, but as for the people aren't going to get hurt. It's the bankers that are going to get hurt.
Well, I have a question, because I know I don't know which Scandinavian country, but there was one that actually put the bankers in jail. What was the economic result of that dynamic?
Denmark, right?
That was Iceland.
Iceland.
Yeah, I think it was Iceland.
And actually, the economic impact was that they came out of a recession within months.
Go figure.
And so here's an interesting one. Do you remember the banking and loan crisis of the late 80s?
Sure do. I don't remember it because I was a child, but I mean, I know of it.
So anyway, the banking and loan crisis had something like over a couple thousand, prosecutions against specific people within the banking industry, and they had several hundred, what's the term when convictions, where people literally went to jail or were penalized for that. The 2008, there was 0 prosecutions.
Well, isn't that kind of due to the incestuous nature of campaign finance, though? Like the protection of their donors?
Yep.
And that's on all sides.
Oh,
yeah.
There's nothing more bipartisan than stealing money.
Yep. God damn it, you're right. Like all the money that's been thrown into F-35 program over the past few years, over the past 10 years, is ridiculous, and that's both sides. And something just disconnected.
I would love to. I'm trying to look for this link right now, and I'm failing. There was a great link that basically talked about the amount of. So you think campaign finance going in to get these people reelected? That's not money that's going to necessarily profit that person individually. These senators and representatives and things like that are actually not coming out with billions of dollars worth of wealth. They might get a couple $100,000, a couple million, but it's really kind of piddly. And then you start talking about the F-35 program, the amount of waste in that. It was something to the point of, if you actually stopped campaign finance and just basically paid these people the sheer amount of money that was going into the graft of re-elections and everything else, they would all walk away billionaires.
Yep.
So it's really this weird perversion where there's a net loss of of for a very fractional net gain of benefit.
Of revenue specifically, but not a loss of value. So what they're trading is they're trading flexibility within their own market, flexibility and leeway to do whatever the fuck they want to do within their market, and the ability to have your daughters throw around shit in your in their playroom. And hi,
Jesus, what's going on?
Hey guys,
these are future voters, so be careful.
So
they're already running.
I have to run in 2 minutes. I gotta go eat dinner. I'm sitting in the car, but I just wanted to tell to one quick thing that it's like my favorite economic story because it's so telling and so important. And Yanis Varoufakis always tells it. But he really says all this nonsense started when Henry Kissinger, who was working for Nixon at the time, you know, they were having economic woes after you know, post Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods wasn't working out anymore. You know, they had to scrap it, so they're having economic woes. And so he goes to someone who's working for him, who would in the future work for the Fed, named Paul Volcker. And he said the question is, every surplus nation does well and every deficit nation fails. So how do we be a deficit nation and just buy cheap goods from everybody, but not fail? And Paul Volcker came back and said, the only way that's possible is if you recycle everyone else's surpluses. And it was brilliant, except it's not working anymore.
Well, take a look at that. That goes back to the entire. We mentioned that we don't have a crisis of mortgages right now. Girls, please. We have a crisis of debt, and so the issue is that crisis is being caused.
That crisis is being caused by daughters.
By these crazy little kids. Anyway, so I apologize on that one.
No worries.
Guys, I love you. I got to run. Ciao, everybody.
Later, D.
All right. So our personal debt crisis is deficit spending by the population writ large, and it's creating a crisis of its own accord. The issue is going to be when if the same thing happens in personal accounting, why would we think it doesn't happen in government accounting?
Yeah, that's 100% true. That's 100% true. Like, why wouldn't that happen in? That's the bone of contention that I had with what Michael Brooks was talking about sovereign debt and whatnot earlier. Like, having an excess amount of sovereign debt is inevitably going to cause problems due to the fact that, you know, somebody's eventually going to call in that chip. But that sovereign debt, who owns the sovereign debt? The American people do. So you're going to ask the American people to lend more money to the country, to give it to whom? To give it to the banks? Why? That makes no sense. Why you would have the American people put out more of their own money that they're never going to see a return on for what? For the F-35 project? That's, I mean, it's so confusing.
And so what is it called? We're talking about the Hallen's razor. Never assume malice when incompetence, you know, when it can be explained by incompetence.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of what we're doing. There's literally, I mean, when you study the economics of the whole thing, there's literally the value of what they're doing has such a low ROI and the consequence is catastrophic. So why would they do that if it was malice or if they were trying to gain from it? Really what it boils down to is just incompetence. They're basically short-sighted, trying to achieve an immediate goal at the risk of the long-term stability.
Yeah, 100%.
It's also local incentive structures. I mean, the point is that the incentives of the general public in terms of their government are very different from the incentive structures of 435 congressmen in the environment of campaign finance, which is why ultimately, if you want to change their decision making, you have to change the incentive structure of that environment.
Yes. Yeah.
There's another great article, you can probably just Google it, is why we don't, like, we pay senators and representatives like $200,000 or something like that. What happens if we paid them $1 million? Or 1.5 million or 2 million?
That was one of the arguments within Republic Lost, is that if you disincentivize sitting representatives from paying or taking in extra money because they have enough money from the job that they're doing, then they're not going to end up it's less likely that they would end up taking money from special interests in order to fund their coffers, if you want to say. I don't think that that's the applicable term, but to back up their asset portfolio. Does that make sense?
Well, and moreover, to Michael's point, you know, the ratio that I've heard quoted is 222 to 1. So for every $1 that is given in campaign finance, $222 in tax breaks, other incentives are accrued by these companies. So it's a, you know, companies, special interests, whatever it may be. It's a great, giving money to campaigns is the deal of the century. And it really, you know, the question is, why doesn't the public do something about this? And I think that, you know, whether it's a sort of myopic focus like Michael's talking about, where people are excited about the benefits that they're getting of like, oh my God, cheap mortgages, this is amazing, or just a sort of lack of awareness or indifference, which is the thing that, you know, Brian was focused on in the conversation with Larry Lessig, where people just don't even know that this is happening or see how it affects them.
Yeah. And the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. Yeah. It's such an intractable situation because there's so much money that is tied to government contracting, and there's so much money that is tied to basically districts within the states, that the more involved the federal government is within these different realms, the more incentivized they are to be on the dole, essentially. Like, why is there a why is there a base in the middle of nowhere in North Dakota that is the home of all the ballistic missiles? Well, it is a strategic location. That's without a doubt. But wouldn't that strategic location be also served well in like somewhere else that's not North Dakota? I don't know. That it's such a complicated and multifaceted situation, you know. And then you get
but
into
there
the
are
argument of why are there even ballistic missiles?
Yeah, and I mean there are, you know, some ones that are pretty where there's not much, you know, question. Like the bridge to nowhere.
Yeah,
was, you know,
I wasn't trying to bring up that old trope.
No, but I mean, there are some
arts.
Yeah, old dead horses that we will beat. No, but you know, or the one that I actually loved from Republic Lost was the one about California tax, where there was this attempt to simplify the tax code. Most people actually, their taxes are quite simple, and you could just send them a pre-filled form, and they would just sign off on it, and they'd be done. But of course, this was opposed by the tax software makers because the last thing we want is people having an easy job doing their taxes. So what we're going to do is we're going to pay a little bit of money to these state senators, keep the tax code complicated, and then we can make a lot of money selling tax software that actually people don't need, doesn't serve the state. But, you know, it becomes these massively dysfunctional systems where ultimately we all lose, even if some people narrowly win.
And the fact of the matter, software is one minor fraction of that loop, because the accountants are some of the major ones. There was the discussion about like a simple postcard size element, and it was funny who actually reacted negatively to that. And it was decently universal, and their excuses weren't that it should be easier for the taxpayer. Their excuses were all of these different interest groups that were yelling at them.
Yeah, that was a topic during the election in 2016. It was so hilarious to hear. I'm like, why do I have to pay somebody? Why do you have to